right, good morning, everyone. This is a pleasure to be back. I think this is a very unusual setup. At the same time, what you're seeing on the screen is what I would see when I do my teaching on my iPad. And you will see all the secrets that I do. Well, this morning, we are going to cover Genesis chapter 14, from verse 8 to chapter 15, verse 18. And herein lies a very important part of the milestone of the story narrative of Abraham. In so doing, we will cover it verse by verse as we go through. But more importantly, as I had mentioned to you previously, the study of Genesis is very much about God. How we see God work. How they interact with God. How Abraham interacted with God. And so on and so forth. And from there, we can see that all these things that we read in Genesis is way before the time of Moses. Before the Torah. And so herein lies how life was with God. And how they lived by faith. And so as we begin, I'd like to take your attention to two segments. In chapter 14, we talk about some of Abraham's exploits. I call it exploits because it's a very unusual narrative which we don't read very much. And in particular, it is an exploit of a war that shows how Abraham was such a leader, not just in leading his family, but in an ability to fight. Something which we seldom even talk about. In chapter 15, we will talk about that famous covenant that God made with Abraham, and I'll share with you a little bit more as what that might mean. In this first segment, we see a situation where there was a war between the kings of the Canaanites and with the kings that is outside of Canaan, that is way up north, and probably where we would call Iran and Iraq today, as they cross over the Euphrates and comes down, and they have a war. And they have a war somewhere north of the Dead Sea, in the plains. We don't know exactly many of these places, but this is where it starts. It begins with 5 kings. The king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela. 5 of them went to the valley of Siddim. And the valley of Siddim, we really don't know exactly where, but it's somewhere north of the Dead Sea where there are plains. When we talk about plains, and if you had a chance to look at some documentary of that area, or you have a chance to visit that place, the plains are literally flat, open, wide, but surrounded by mountains. And that's an ideal place for most of the ancient wars to happen, where they fight, right? And that's where they went. 5 of them, verse 9, they were fighting Kedorlaomer. This is the king of Elam. Now, king of Elam is somewhere far away. We don't know exactly where he is, but Elam is also a name of the son of Seth, if you read in Genesis chapter 10. And much of the places up north where Abraham originally came from was Semitic people. There was Tidal, the king of the nations, Araphel, the king of Shinar, which is in Iraq today, Arioch, the king of Elasar. These were the 4 kings versus the 5 kings. So that's the story that we have. They came, the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits. By that, it means that there were big holes on the ground where there were bitumen, black sticky substance, bubbling out of the ground. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, means they lost the war. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. And that's the mountains surrounding them. Verse 11 is what I ask you to pay attention to. These 4 kings took all the property of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions, and they left. And by the way they left, you would assume that they are not going further south. They're going back home. They came, they conquered, and they left. And they also took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, and that's Haran. And we read that in the last time that I was with you on Zoom. And Haran died when he was in Ur, and he took care of Lot, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. You also know from the previous chapter that they had a split, and Lot took one side, and Abraham took the other side. And that's where Lot was. And so that was the background. Now Abraham comes to the rescue. The one who had escaped, meaning as they were fighting, and they came to tell Abraham, the Hebrew or Eber, the one who crossed over to the other side. That's what it means. The word Hebrew comes from a word where it refers to him who have come from the other side, crossed the river. And that would be the Euphrates. So he came across the Euphrates. He's a Hebrew. And he dwelt in the terebinth tree of Mamre. We read about that in the last time we were here in Genesis 12. Then we have 3 persons. Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and the brother of Aner. And they were allies of Abraham, which means that Abraham had partnered a few people who dwelt around him. And Abraham heard this, that his brother was taken. Now notice this. His brother, right here, and we read it was his brother's son. And that tells us a little bit about the culture of how they refer to people. Lot's father was a brother of Abraham. And in that culture, anyone around that line, that lineage, would be referenced to the brother. Because there is no nephew. Right? We have an English word called nephew, your brother's son. But in the Hebrew, it's all father, mother, brother, sister. That's it. And all along that line would be called brother. So Lot is called a brother, but we know that he's the brother's son. So he's not exactly a direct brother, but he's referenced as a brother. We also read in verse 14 that he had 318 trained servants who were born in his own house. What does that mean? It means that he has a very big servant. And these servants are trained. Trained for what? Trained for war. So that they as a family can be protected. Don't forget, they came from Ur to Haran and then came down south. He didn't come alone. He came with everyone of his household. And here gives us a glimpse of that household. That household has defensive capabilities so that they are not afraid of where they went. But here, Abraham took these people, and then I want to point out to you this particular word, Dan. It's not Daniel, it's just Dan. And in the Bible, Dan refers to the territory most up north. Most up north. So if you look at this map here, you could see where it may be. This is Dan, and this is the territory of Dan. But the original territory of Dan was right there. Could you see that? The original territory of Dan is here. Dan moved up north, and then right up top here is called Tel Dan. Now, I visited Tel Dan last November. It is the most northern part of Israel. So when you read the Bible, sometimes you read about the borders of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. You remember that? If you read from Dan to Beersheba, basically it's telling us from the most northern point to the most southern point of the land. And that's as far as Abraham chased them. So remember, when they came, they left, so they were on the way home. And Abraham chased them, and chased them as far as Dan, because they started here, and then they went as far up north. And then they also divided the forces and pursued them as far as Hovah, which is north of Damascus, which means that they took a right turn and went all the way up there as well. This will give you a sense of the terrain. How far that Abraham went. What was his mission? To rescue Lot. Not to defeat the forces, to rescue Lot. Well, if you have your Bibles with you, I'll just do a little sidebar. The word north literally means left hand. Actually, Abraham chased them to the left hand of Damascus. So what do you mean left hand? And this is how the Hebrew people look at directions. Their bearing, well, our bearing is always north. So when you look at the clock, we always tell ourselves it's 12 o'clock, it's north. And we use that as our bearing. But when you read the Bible, the Hebrew people's bearing is east. And so they will always face east. So where does the temple face? East. Where does the tabernacle face? East. So the bearing is always east. All right? If the bearing is east, what is the left hand? North. And hence we get the word north here. All right? So that's a little bit of sidebar for you. And verse 16 tells us he was successful. He brought everything back. What is everything? Basically, he brought back everything the northern kings took. Not just Lot. Everything that the northern kings took. And also brought back his brother and his property. And that's how you read verse 16. So he didn't just bring back Lot. He brought back Lot and whatever Lot had. He brought back everything that these kings of the north took from Sodom and Gomorrah. So remember, that's how it's read. And then the king of Sodom went to meet him. But in between this story comes a very special passage. It's just a few verses. And we read of Melchizedek. That's it. Melchizedek appears on the scene. Melchizedek is a name called the King of Sodom. And Sodom is a Hebrew word for right, or righteous, or righteousness as a noun. What is right? He stands for justice. Right? He's the King of Sodom. He is also known as the King of Shalem. Shalem is the root for the word that we all are very familiar with, which is shalom. Right? And we know shalom as an equivalent English word of peace. Basically, the word peace comes from shalem, which is complete. You've made complete payments. So everything is complete, then you are at peace. Nobody's going to chase you for it. So he is also the King of Peace. He brought out bread and wine. Now that's interesting. Bread and wine is a staple of people. Something to eat, something to drink. And basically, if they were Orientals like us, we'll bring out rice and Chinese tea. Right? But it is very much an idiom that he is having a fellowship with Abraham. You don't normally sit down and eat with anybody. And you only eat with people that you know and you have a fellowship with. So they brought up bread. Now basically it's literally bread. And bread is also an equivalent word that we translate the word food. All right? But it's literally bread because everything there is made of flour. And wine. They don't have, well, I would say, they don't have much grape juice. And the reason being is that the grapes in the land there doesn't make well for drinking. But the wine there is great for drinking wine. And because it only harvests a certain part of the year, they have to drink the rest of the year, and it's all fermented. So it's really wine. And if you're not aware, those of you who are wine drinkers, the Shiraz type of grapes is from Israel. And it's not a nice drinking juice, trust me. And so they serve wine, and wine has been around for ages. And it goes with the bread. And here they have a fellowship. Why did they have a fellowship? Why did Abraham suddenly come to Melchizedek? And he was there, he appeared. And it says that he is a priest of the Most High. El Elyon. That's how the word goes. He's the God of the Most High. And it seems that the people there know who the God of the Most High, including the King of Sodom when we get there. And so he is a priest, one who serves. And you will know that throughout the Bible, priest is somebody who mediates, who orchestrates, who does all the rituals on behalf of the people who come to God. And so this is the God that we all recognize, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's called the God Most High. And Melchizedek blesses him. He says, you've come, we have bread and wine. And he pronounces good things. And he says, blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor, meaning he's the one who erected, he built all this heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High. Well, instead of Abraham, it's God now. And blessings comes. So you remember in Psalms, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. And the word bless is exactly the same. And so when you turn to God, he praises God. He pronounces good things about God. And this is the origination. So don't think about blessing the Lord coming from the Psalms. This is the beginning of praising God that we have in recognition in Genesis chapter 14. And he says, he has delivered you from your enemies. Deliver the enemies into your hand so that he is the one who made you victorious. In the Hebrew context, they always associate the good things to God. And we do too. When something happens and we celebrate a victory, we celebrate something that we are thrilled with, the first thing that we should do is to acknowledge God. Because we see him as that. The man behind, the God behind the victory. And so that was what happened here with Melchizedek. And that's the acknowledgement. But the point I want to point out to you is this. He gave a tenth of everything. Everything of what? So remember I told you he went. He not only rescued Lot and his property, he rescued everything of the king of Sodom and Gomorrah. And here he gave a tenth of what he had brought back. So the first things he did was he gave a tenth. And that seems to be a ritual that is not Torah. It's way before, right? It's Genesis chapter 14. So giving a tenth is to take care of God's people, the ones who serve God. So we read in the book of Exodus and Leviticus that the tithe is given for the Kohen, the priests, the Levites, who do not inherit. And here gives us that pattern, that the priest of God is to be taken care of. A tenth of what he brought back was a lot. But this is Abraham's pattern for us. Take care of God's servants. And we don't have to think of it as the law. It is the common practice. And it is the right thing to do. And he is the king of the right things, the righteousness, right? So let's carry on. After this episode with Melchizedek, remember, he has given a tenth. Now he's got 90% left. He comes back and says to the king of Sodom, here's the balance. And the king of Sodom says, give me the people, but the rest of the barang you can take with you. Which is a lot, which is 90% what's left. But Abraham said to the king of Sodom, verse 22. So you can see verse 22 right here. I raised my hand to the Lord. This is a symbol or a symbolic gesture of a promise to God. To the Lord Most High. How do they know? Well, to the Lord. That's Jehovah. And in the English, we can't see it. So this would be the YHVH. The Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And Abraham knows God by a name. Jehovah. El Elyon. The maker of heaven and earth. And so when Abraham discusses this, did you think that the king of Sodom would be scratching his head like, who in the world are you talking about? So when you read the Bible, you'll be surprised to see that these are people who are not shocked to hear a new name dropped. We read of this in Genesis chapter 12, right? You should have read that when Pharaoh recognized the name of God and when God spoke to him. And throughout the whole of Genesis, you find that people who are not with Abraham actually knows of God. But they don't recognize and worship God the way Abraham does. Remember, Abraham came from a family who made idols as a living. Tarach made idols for a living. Later, when you get to the story of Laban, when Leah, Rachel, and Jacob left, he came riding, chasing them down, not looking for the daughters, but looking for his little idols. Why? Because that's the family heirloom. That's a family trait. That's where Abraham came from. But Abraham knew Jehovah God not as a little rock, but as a very personal God, walking by faith. So chapter 12 gave us the whole gist of walking with God. So he says, I will take nothing. Nothing means nothing. So he expresses, not a thread to a sandal strap. I will take nothing of yours, lest you say that the king of Sodom made Abraham rich. So he was very honorable. He was already rich, but he could get richer. And you know how money is, right? Nobody says no to more money. Not even Bill Gates, right? And when you are rich, you want to get richer. But he has his principles. He knows where to draw the line. And as he knows God, he knows where these things come from. That's his relationship with God, which we seldom see. He doesn't take what is not his, lest somebody says that he was made rich by the hand of another who is not God. So that's how he knows God. And I trust that we can know God that way too. Now, I must admit to you, when it comes to money, it's very hard to draw that line. Because money is a very different problem than a piece of bread. And so here, when it comes to who made Abraham rich, who made Abraham the way he is, and the narrative tells us very clearly, it can only be God. Because he is honorable to God. He knows where to draw that line, that he doesn't take what is not his. So moving on. Let me wrap up chapter 14. When we come into a success, when we celebrate success, I trust that you'll be like Abraham coming to God, like Melchizedek to bless the Lord, to remember who is behind all these. That we recognize the fact that it's not by our strength that we achieved. Just as Abraham knew that, yes, he won that little battle, but the recognition is due to God. And that is how I think we should always remember that when we get into success, that it doesn't get to our heads. And so Abraham didn't allow his success to get into his heads. Remember, 5 kings lost to these 4. And Abraham, with 300 over people, overpowered them. Can you imagine? He is an incredible military leader, which you and I will never see. That's how you should see this. He did what the 5 kings of the Canaanites couldn't do. And he took everything back. And of course the king of Sodom says, you can take it all. But he knows his main mission was to rescue Lot. Why? Because honor, family honor, is also equally important. He takes care of his deceased brother's interests. And that's how the culture was. Well, in our days, perhaps we may not look at sibling relationships that way. But in those days, they will die for the family. And that's what he did. So he is a great military achievement. With 300 odd people overpowering 4 kings who won the battle over 5 kings. So you just imagine that. Would success get to his head? Well, Abraham didn't allow that. So he remembers God. Now, after all these things, of course, we flip our Bibles to the next chapter. Something happens. The word of Jehovah came to Abraham in a vision. Now, most of the time, we don't know how God speaks to Abraham. We know in chapter 12 that God revealed himself to Abraham. This is where the land is. But we don't pay attention to how that conversation and that engagement comes from. We don't see that with us today, but that's because it's Abraham, right? That's the beginning of this narrative of the promise. The word of the Lord is something that he can hear. But it comes through not in a dream, but in a vision. In a vision would mean that he's seeing something beyond what is normal. And he could tell the difference, I would imagine. And in this case, when he saw that, it may be for the first time. And God says, do not be afraid, Abraham. I am 2 things. And so God reveals himself and tells him 2 important things. I'm here to protect you, your shield. The meaning of the word shield is to enclose you, to put a garden around you, a fence around you, to hedge around you. That's the whole idea. And you probably would have read some of these things from the book of Job, right? That God put a hedge around Job. So that's the concept. So God says, I am your shield. I'm here to surround you, to protect you. But more importantly, number 2, the English says, your exceedingly great reward. This is an intensive expression. There is something that I will give you out of a promise, out of a covenant, out of a contract, that is immensely great, that you cannot imagine. That's what God is saying. And I am going to do that for you. And that's the first verse of the promise. But Abraham replied. I'm sure Abraham remembers Genesis chapter 12. God says, I'm going to make you a great nation. But in chapter 11, I bring your attention back that Abraham married a beautiful wife called Sarai. But the Bible tells us in the end of chapter 11 that she is barren. And Abraham was a very faithful husband. Although she was barren, he never remarried. Which means what? To someone who is rich, you have no heir. It's easy, isn't it? They go and marry another woman and they have another child and they have an heir. But he was dedicated to her. And in this case, he must be thinking, God says he's going to make me into a great nation. If there is a great nation that's coming from me, I'm sure Abraham would be thinking, I don't see that happening, right? My wife is not able to have a child. If she's not able to have a child, who might that be? And so verse 2 says, you know, I go childless. You look at this word here, childless. Basically, he is stripped bare. No children. You just look at me. Nothing. Right? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Eliezer is the head steward. Maybe we call it the chief butler. Right? He takes care of the family. And in those days, if you don't have any kids, who are you going to give it to? And he's the most next trusted person, but it's not of the bloodline. Now, you need to understand that the Hebrew is just like us. The bloodline, the eldest son, all these are important elements. And it pains him to say that there's nobody else. So God, are you saying that all these great reward is coming from Eliezer? Then Abraham said, you have given me no offspring. Now everywhere you look at this word, offspring, descendants, it comes from one English word called seed, zera. It's a seed. And that's how it's always expressed in the singular. But the one born in my house should be an heir. But I have nobody. And that's how he felt. Just take a moment to think of how Abraham feels. You are going on in age. You have lots of money, lots of wealth, lots of property, but you have no children. And you know one day you're going to go away. And where are all these things going to? I'm sure that comes into the mind of Abraham as well. And so he speaks to God this way. He said, God, you are going to bless me of all these things, but there's nobody to continue my family lineage. And hence, this is the big lesson that we're going to learn as we complete chapter 15. Verse 4 comes the reply of God. And behold, the word of Jehovah came to Abraham saying this, this one shall not be your heir. Who is this one? Who is this one? This one is Eliezer. That's the butler, right? The chief steward of the house. God says, no, not on your life. In the plan of God, it has to come from Abraham. And so this shall not be your heir, but the one who will come from your own body. Now the New King James is a bit polite, right? Basically it's saying that this is the one who will come from your loins. You will personally see to it that you have a child. It's your own child, your own flesh and blood. That one shall be your heir. Can you imagine what goes on in Abraham's mind? That, yeah, I know that. Are you saying that since Sarai cannot have a child, that I'm going to have another wife to do that? And so that would be a human logic put to all these things. But in his mind, he says, God has said, you will have a son. I'm not going to kid you. And it will be your own son, from your own loins, your very own seed, so to speak. And then he brought him outside. So whenever you read all these inside, outside, one of the things that you should always remember is the Hebrew language is meant for us to imagine. The picture, the video that's playing in your mind. Which means that if Abraham has to go outside, he was having a conversation with God inside. Inside where? Where do the Hebrew people or the nomads stay? In a tent. So he had conversations with God in chapter 15 inside the tent. After God says that no, your son will be one who comes from your loins, God says, come with me and we go outside. And that's what it means, brought him outside. And not only outside, you remember, if you all had a chance to go out to, I don't know, somewhere away from the city, away from the lights, you will enjoy the heavenly skies. I'm not sure whether you have, but if you have a chance, you should try that. But you look up to the skies, and that's what God says. Look toward the heaven, the skies, and count the stars if you're able to number them. Now, That is the action. That is rhetorical. It's not asking Abraham to say, now let's count 1, 2, 3. That's not the point. It's asking Abraham, you just look up to the skies and you see so many stars up there. Can you actually count them? And of course, the rhetorical answer would be no. That would be the most normal expression. I want to point out to you that the word here, count, and the word number is exactly the same words. And hereby, a little sidebar, trips us up when we read an English translation. The English translation is designed and translated for the purpose of reading. So that when you read the Bible, it reads like an English book. And if you remember your school days, you are always taught never to use the same word in the same sentence, not even in the same paragraph, because it's bad English style. And so you're always encouraged to go by a thesaurus. So you find synonyms, so that the words that you choose, although they may mean the same, but you use different words so that you can have a good style. And that's how the English Bible is translated. But in the Hebrew, they don't care about styles. They care about specificity. When it says number, it means number. You can say number all the way 10 times in one sentence, you will know what is being said. But not in English, unfortunately. So you see, the word count and the word number are both exactly the same words. However, if you had taken a dictionary, an Oxford or Webster or whatever that may be, you will find English nuances that will lead you down the wrong rabbit hole. So one of the biggest challenges you have is that try to find the original meaning of the underlying when you do a study. But when you read it, it's great. It's a great English text. Because when you read the Bible, you can't really see the problems of the Hebrew. So that's what I leave with you. Then he said to him, if you can't count the stars, that's how your descendants will be. That's how many that will be. Now this phrase is important, and you should mark it in your Bible, because it reappears itself many times throughout the 5 books of Moses. When we come to the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you would find that this is a fulfillment when you get there. One of the things that you find is that when you say you can't count the number of stars, it means that it's innumerable. That's basically what it means. Right? Although the sky is there, if you sat down long enough, maybe you could have counted up to 10,000. But the idea here is you can't count. It's innumerable. And so when you get to Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the same phrase will appear. Your descendants are like the stars now. Why? Because it's innumerable. When they went into Egypt, they were 70. When they left Egypt, they were about 1.5 million people. That's what the picture is all about. And then verse 6. That's the most important part. And Abraham believed the Lord, and Jehovah accounted it to him for righteousness. And we read that a lot in the New Testament, right? But the thing that you need to see is that the original intent is, what did Abraham believed in? Abraham trusted the Word of God. What he said. That's important for us to realize. If we cannot take God at His word, you don't have faith. That's what it means. Now obviously, Abraham can't see his descendants. He can see the stars. He might be able to try to imagine his descendants. But you know what's blocking that mind? He doesn't have a son. That's the problem. So that disconnect requires faith. I don't have a son. I have a promise. God showed me all the stars, and that's the ultimate result that's going to happen. Between no child to uncountable requires faith. But who said that? He believed in Jehovah God. This is the same God that called him out of Ur, brought him out to Haran, and he came with no maps, no Waze, no Google Maps. He didn't know where he was going. He took his whole entourage by listening to God. That's faith. Take God at his words. Now, although he may have this little turmoil inside him about no child, he believed. Okay, if you said so, okay. That's belief. Do you notice it's very childlike? If you teach Sunday school, you appreciate this. But when you grow up, we now have 10,000, not reasons, 10,000 questions. Why it might not be. And that's doubts. But you need to clear your mind. Why did Abraham trust God? Because he has been trusting him all this while. What more about something that he cannot imagine? Because he is Jehovah God. Now is the time of test, whether you do believe or not. I think one of the things that we can take away from here is that God is a dependable God. What he says, he will do. May not be on our time, but he will do. So he told Abraham, you'll be a great nation, but even at this time, he's got nothing, no son. So it bothered him. Of course it bothered him, he's human, right? But it is not yet. That takes faith. That takes faith for us to believe God when we can't see it happening. We are people who are anxious. Our time is imposed on God. It says, why not? But God says, not yet. Now, in the case of Abraham, that not yet is very painful, isn't it? Because he's not getting any younger. He's not in his teens. He is, at least at this point in time, 70 already. Okay? So, believe God because he is faithful. And that requires faith. You can't see it, but you have to trust him at his word. That's a lesson from Abraham. Taking God at his word is faith. Belief. To put confidence, to hold up God's word. The word faith in the Hebrew, if you remember in the book of Exodus, when they left and crossed the Red Sea, and it was at Rephidim, I believe, and the Amalekites came and fought with them, and this was a famous Sunday school story, when Abraham had to lift up his hands, and every time his hands fell, they lost. So we have Aaron, and Hur, one on either side, holding up, supporting his hand. You remember that story? That is the same word as faith. Hold up because you trust God at his word. No matter what. That's confidence in God's word. That's having a peg in the ground so that you don't let the tent fly away. So the Hebrew words for faith is very vivid, it's very concrete. It's not just trust lah, just believe. So you cannot imagine what belief is. Hang on to it. Hang on to it. Hold on to it. So Abraham took God at his word. Nothing to debate, basically. Now comes the core of this chapter. I introduce you this word, cut. Cut a covenant. Something which we seldom talk about. Those of you in the business line, we always have this phrase, let's cut the deal. Have you heard of that? Let's cut the deal. And then you may ask yourself, where did this cut the deal come from? It actually comes from the Bible. Cut a covenant Well, of course, you don't read it in the English. Because cut the covenant doesn't sound good in our English language. But literally speaking, God cut a covenant. And in this case, literally cutting. And that's why we get the phrase, cut the deal. Verse 7, God said to Abraham, I am Jehovah. Always remember when God pronounces himself and he says, who am I? I am Jehovah. Remember that name. I am Jehovah who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, notice this. Unfortunately, in the translation, we have a bit of a mismatch. It sounds great in the English, but the nuance might be lost. He says, I am Jehovah who caused you to leave Ur of the Chaldees. Because if you read Genesis chapter 11 at the end, who was with them? Terach brought the whole family out of Ur and arrived at Haran. And in chapter 12, Abraham continued that journey from Haran down south. But that entire journey is caused by God. That's what it means. God caused you to leave Ur. God didn't call Abraham from Ur. God called Abraham from Haran. So that's how you see some of the nuances. But what's the intent? To give you this land. I highlight this land is because this entire promise is about the land. Now, what is so big a deal of land here? A few things you need to bear in mind. In that culture, Abraham had nothing, right? He left Ur, where he originally was, all his relatives, and then he went with his father and his other brother, and he resided in Haran. When he left Haran, his entire family was still there. Now, if you stayed in a place long enough, it becomes yours. So, what does Abraham have? Nothing. Nothing. You may have all the wealth, but two things you don't have. You don't have a son, and you don't have a land that is yours. So God says, I'm going to give you both. I promise you a nation, I promise you a land, but you have nothing right now. So I am going to give you this land. When it says this land, it is very specific. Not just any land, but the land that he is standing on right now. Remember, he came out of the tent, he looked up where he is. That's in Hebron right now, in Mamre. Somewhere down south, towards the center of the entire piece of land. It says, this is the land that I will give you. God is going to give him that land. To inherit. Not to own it now. And that's the key of the whole verse. Abraham did not have the land. Abraham had a promise to the land. So that one day, he will inherit. Now notice, remember I mentioned to you how relationships are linked. Lot is Abraham's brother. But we know it's brother's son. If it's in the lineage of Abraham, anyone behind Abraham would be Abraham's. That Abraham will inherit. That's how it is expressed. That the descendants of Abraham will inherit. What does inherit mean? Now, in our terms, the English word means that you read a will, you've done, and your father would have left you, with a car, with the land, with the house, and that's a will. And you didn't buy it, you inherited because he passed it down to you after he is gone. Now the similarity is that Abraham must not be around. Otherwise it's not an inheritance. So Abraham will leave the scene. But his children. So when God says, I will give you the land, you would mean Abraham and everybody behind Abraham, his descendants. That's the meaning. To inherit then doesn't mean just to take over, but to possess. It also means to dispossess. So when they come back, and if you read the book of Joshua, they came to inherit the land. They came to possess the land, which somebody else is there, which also means they have to dispossess from its original tenants. Do you see that? This one word has these two meanings. And that is what God is saying. One day you will come to take over the land, or you means your descendants. Verse 8, it says, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? How will I? I mean, it's a fair question. And God says, come, do this for me. Verse 9, I bring your attention to verse 9. So bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Verse 10, he brought all these to him, and he cut them into two. It's literally cut them into two. Down the middle. This is a very specific word. It's not just cut anywhere. Cut into two, straight in the middle. You place each piece opposite the other, meaning he has to line the carcasses. One piece on either side. What does that mean? It means that now you're putting the carcasses on both sides so that you can pass through them. Now moving on. This is the covenant. So what does a covenant mean? In simple English terms, we call it an agreement, a contract. So it's like an ancient contract. But in our contracts today, you have two parties to sign, right? And each party signing means that we both agree. And there are consequences for those who would break the covenant. See that? Basically, the concepts are the same. The covenant of those days is the same. And now we need to pay attention to the scene as the narrative unfolds. 1, when the sun was going down is the time. Sun goes down would be towards sunset, right? So it's not sunrise. We're not talking about morning. When it's sunset time, you would know that it's going to get dark and darker and darker. And this is out there in the wilderness. So there is not going to be city lights. There's no Thomas Edison flicking on the electric lamp, right? So when it gets dark, it will be ultimately very dark. And then Abraham was described as going into a deep sleep. When you read in Genesis chapter 2, and God made the man to go to sleep before he took the ribs out, that's exactly the same word. He fell into a deep sleep, completely gone. But while that happened, behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. I ask you to go back and do your research. Every time the Bible speaks about darkness, in much of the context, darkness represents the presence of God. In a cloud, in a dark cloud, where you can't see. So when you read God on Mount Sinai giving the law, all of these issues, the ancient Near East thinks of darkness as clouds. It's a thing. And so when you read Job, you'll find a lot of these nuances. So darkness is not no light. Darkness is literally the description of the presence of God. So go back and do your checks. But the important thing is in verse 13. While he is in deep sleep, Abraham could hear this. God said to Abraham, not in a face-to-face, but now in a deep sleep. Not in the earlier part of Genesis 15 where God appeared to him in a vision. This time round, he is completely immobile. There is a purpose for the deep sleep, by the way. So it's not just for the sake of style and variation to chapter 15. The deep sleep means he is not party to anything that's happening right now. He is completely immobile. He is not in his normal state of mind. He is not awake. And he is not alert in the sense of us participating. Deep sleep here literally means that Abraham has no part in what is coming hereafter. But God said this to him. Before everything happened, God says, know certainly that your seed, your descendants, first will become strangers or foreigners in a land that does not belong to them. But the interesting thing is that they've never had a land. They don't have a land now, but they will be in a place where it's not theirs, basically, so that they can then go to a place that will belong to them one day. And will serve them, and will serve the nation that they will be in. And this nation will humble them for 400 years. And this nation whom they serve, God will one day judge. God will one day execute judgment upon them. After that, after all the judgments, I hope you begin to see Exodus showing up in your mind. After this, they will leave with great possessions. What does that mean? So whenever you study the Bible, it says you will leave with great possessions, would always assume that you started with no possession. Do you see that? They have nothing. They were humble. They have nothing. But when they leave, they are going to be rich. That's basically what it says. You are going to be in a land which is not yours. You will serve that nation. You will be humble. But when you leave, you will be rich. And when you read the book of Exodus, that's exactly what happened. Right? Verse 15. The principle of an inheritance. Abraham, you will go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. What does that mean? God is telling Abraham, just hear my words. This is an inheritance. You will not see it. Your job will be done. You will say bye-bye to this scene, and the next one following you on will be the ones that will inherit. But in the fourth generation, they shall return here. So God is very specific about the land. This place where you looked up and couldn't count the stars, this very land is where they will come back to. And so we shall wrap up chapter 15. God cut a one-sided covenant. Have you ever seen a one-sided covenant? Well, I haven't. Well, I would wish somebody would write me a contract that only that person will do everything, I don't have to do anything. And I will get everything. Right? And the penalty would be on the one who signs it. Now, the reason why this is done this way is that God is trying to convince Abraham, in addition to you taking me at my words, I am going to cut you this covenant. And God is saying, I am serious about this. I want you never to forget. Not just you, but since it's got to be documented, your children and your children after you, that they know that God is serious about His covenant, about His words. So when it came to pass, the sun went down. You remember, the sun was coming down. He fell asleep. And then he was hearing God in his sleep. Now after the sun went down, it was dark. And that's the state. You remember I told you, you're in the wilderness, sun goes down, there's no lights. So it was absolutely pitch dark. And there appeared a smoking oven. This is a fire pot. It's a pot with fire in there. And a burning torch. That's a flaming torch. And these are, I would say, the same instance. It's to show that someone is there and that someone is God. And this is representing God's actions. And he went where? He passed between those pieces. Remember, he cut it into two. So there's a walkway. So cutting the covenant is actually very literal. It's not imaginary. It's not signing. So it's very vivid. God walked through and he was the party to the covenant. But the focus here is, there is no Abraham. Where is Abraham? He is asleep. He has nothing to do with this. This is all God. And God is saying, I am going to sign this covenant. That's how serious God was. Though you can't see your son, you can see the stars. Take my word for it. I'm going to cut you this covenant to show that I'm a serious God. On the same day, God made a covenant. And that's where we see the word karat berit. Cut a covenant. Cut a deal. That's where we have in Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. So, next time you sign a contract, remember God. Right? But this particular agreement is very unusual. It's a one-sided, which we never see. This is not a will, by the way. This is a covenant, which means that in a typical covenant, when two persons do it, anyone who fails their obligations would be like the animals, cut in two. That's how serious this is. This is called a blood covenant. And then God says this, and let's pay attention to this when we close. Look at these words. To your descendants I have given this land. And that word descendant, again, is the singular noun called seed. So, to your seed. Not any one seed, but one who comes from your loins. That's how the Hebrew describes seeds. And from Genesis chapter 1 all onwards, the reproduction of your kind would be through the seed. And that's how it's used. So the son of is literally the seed of. And so God says that this land that you're standing on, I will give it to your children, your descendants, those who come from you. From the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. The idea here is there is a dimension of the land. It's a good land. It's a big land. So let me just wrap this up here. If you have a chance to go to, say, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, you will immediately come to your conclusions. Without being a property investor, you can actually see that in that entire area, Israel is the best real estate. The reason is God is giving them the best in that place. You can't get any better. The difference of that place is you must trust God because you would need water. You trust God, the windows of heaven will come. So when you read Deuteronomy, even Malachi, if they don't trust God, no water. No water, no crops, no harvest, no food. What's going to happen? They will leave the place. So this land that God gave them is the best place. Where you plant things, it will grow. And later on you say that, no, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. And I can tell you, when you go there, you know why you want to stay in Israel and not in Egypt and Jordan. You can't do anything in the other countries. Right? And so God essentially is telling Abraham, this is the best place. I'm giving you the best place, but not right now. One day down the road, you will have it when your descendants, when your nation come about. And so Abraham has a big test. God is a faithful God. God gave a promise, He will make it done. He even demonstrated in the covenant, in cutting a covenant with Abraham. But more importantly, behind the scene, God is giving Abraham and his descendants the best in the land. Better than Iraq, better than Lebanon, better than Syria, better than Jordan, better than Egypt. That's the best land because it really grows. But that requires faith. Abraham needs to have faith. His children need to have faith. See, that's the whole relationship God had with Abraham, to teach them to have faith. God will fulfill what He says. That's why you have a unilateral. God is trying to tell Abraham what? The son that you're going to have is coming from me. You can't make that happen. All right? Our God is a God of covenants. He is serious to make these covenants. So God is not flippant. So I say something and I cut a covenant. He makes a lot of statements. He promises, but covenants are very specific. But He is also a covenant-keeping God. When He makes a covenant, He will make it come true. And in this case, a one-sided, so all focus is on God. Can we trust this God like Abraham? I ask you to sit back, go back and read these few chapters again. It's not about Abraham really. It's about how God deals with Abraham. How Abraham knows God. Abraham is just like us. But in his walk with God, he learns how to have faith. He learns what it means to be truthful, be faithful, be honorable. But you realize it's harder for Abraham to be faithful than us. Think about it. He is immensely rich. And then thereby we ask ourselves, when you're rich, it's harder to trust God. But he says no, he can draw his lines. That's how well he knows God. Many of us will say, well, when you're poor, it's easy to trust God. Actually, when you're poor, it's hard to trust God. But trusting God is not about wealth. It's about who you know. People around him knows God Most High, El Elyon. But they don't know Him like the way Abraham does. I'm inviting all of us to go back and reread the book of Genesis so far, to look at that God. And then ask ourselves, how are we trusting God today? That we can't see. That the things that is promised is not seen yet. And yet Abraham believed God, took His word for it, and continued living. That is faith. So faith is not by sight. Now, if you could see, there's nothing to believe. But that faith is to take God at His words. I invite all of us to take God at His words. Be Abraham. All right? God bless us with His words.